As of late, funding in open source has been an ever-growing topic. It is tied to everything we care about, whether it's the desktops we use or the random little libraries we rely on. Free software means free as in freedom, not free as in beer. I know you've probably heard this a million times before, but it needs to be said. We cannot operate this space if the funding isn't there. Sadly, people have rent, food, and various other bills they need to pay. And if developers want to spend more time actually working on the software they want to make, working on these open source projects, they would love to be able to do so in more than just the little bit of free time they have outside of their regular day job. There are people out there who have an amazing job that lets them get paid to work on open source. Most people in this space are simply not in that situation. It would be absolutely incredible if more people were funded to do so, and not just funded at like minimum wage. I mean funded at a reasonable competitive rate that makes people actually want to be a developer in the open source space. On that note, how many of you are aware about the GNOME Foundation funding situation? Most of you probably saw this last year. GNOME recognized as public interest infrastructure. This was when GNOME received a €1 million investment from the Sovereign Tech Fund. And this is absolutely massive. This, whilst not being something you can rely on until the end of time, does still go very far in funding very important development work and does help out the project a lot. But this is a one-off thing, and it's basically a grant, and it can't just be spent on random things. This money has a very specific purpose. So with that in mind, here is a very interesting post from Robert McQueen, the president of the GNOME Foundation board. Finances. This is the very important part. As you may be aware, the GNOME Foundation has operated at a deficit, non-profit speak-free loss, i.e. spending more than we've been raising each year for over 3 years, essentially running the foundation on reserves from some substantial donations received 4 to 5 years ago. The foundation has a reserves policy which specifies a minimum amount of money we want to keep in our accounts. This is so that if there is a significant interruption to our usual income, we can preserve our core operations while we work on new funding sources. We've now hit the buffers of this reserve policy, meaning the board can't approve any more deficit budgets to keep spending at the same level. We must increase our income. Hearing deficit budget doesn't really give you a clear indication of just how much money they've been spending. You know they are spending more than they are bringing in, but by how much? Well, the GNOME Foundation reports are all available on their website. This is the finances at a glance for 2018, and even without zooming in, you can already see the big shift that happened from 2017 to 2018. So in 2017, most of the funding came from the advisory board, this being the corporate sponsors of the board, and then GWADEC. That year, they made a total of $274,576. Then 2018 happened. GWADEC didn't really change. It was a little bit lower. The advisory board went slightly down, but the donations went from 24,000 to 823,000. That year, they brought in 1,073,000. This didn't really affect the expenses because this was a very unexpected increase in donations. This was mainly due to 2 large donations made. So 2017 to 2018, expenses went up, but they weren't massive. Here we start to see a bit of a change. 2019 still had massive funding. Only 915,000 this time, but still way higher than it normally would be. As you would expect, expenses also went up. Now from 365,000 to 600,000, but they weren't running a deficit. This is the next year. Again, massive funding, 925,000, the majority coming from donations. And as you'd expect, the expenses also went up from 600,000 to 789,000. Now we have 2021. This year, you can already see what happened. It went from 925,000 back to the normal 286,000. This, as they say, was to be expected, as 2021 did not have any high-stakes events and the pandemic did not allow for many in-person events. Okay, fair enough. The expenses stayed really high, 926,000. We don't yet have the report from 2023, so the latest is 2022. This year, the funding was a bit higher, this time 363,000. And the expenses were also very high, coming down, now only 659,000. It should be noted, this is not a situation of just funding absolute nonsense. The majority of the expenses every single year has been staff and other programming. Events has been a very small budget. Marketing has been a very small budget. Honestly, internships should probably be higher, and administration is also really low, usually in the range of 20 to 30,000. My point here being, nobody is getting rich from the GNOME Foundation. Maybe they're making a pretty reasonable salary, but that's about as far as it goes. What worries me here is how quickly the GNOME Foundation felt the need to burn through their cash reserves, because obviously they have to spend it, they are a non-profit. But they didn't have to spend it as quickly as they did. What's important with a foundation like this is doing things sustainably, because if you go from $300,000 of expenses up to $900,000, there is a lot more things you can fit in that extra $600,000. But if you do that for enough years and you don't have the funding for it, you're going to have to suddenly go back down to that $300,000 mark, and that is going to mean having to cut a lot of things you were spending money on, whereas the other option is raise up your funding, but don't raise it up to your absolute limit. Raise it up so you drain that money out at a much slower pace, and you have much more time to adapt to the fact that you are no longer getting this massive funding. As an example, here is the KDE EV Community Report. This also has a bunch of other things that we don't really care about right now, but way down here, we have the income and the expenses. In 2022, they also ran a deficit, bringing in $285,000 and spending $384,000. But the reason they could do that is because of 2018. In that year, they brought in $591,000 and only spent $210,000. Now, you might think that in the years going forward, they would massively increase their expenses, go up to $500,000, and just burn through all of it straight away. Well, no, because that is not sustainable. That year, I know the table broke, ignore that, they brought in $183,000, and they spent $258,000, running a $70,000 deficit. 2020, they didn't run a deficit. They made $210,000 and spent $179,000. 2021, they also didn't run a deficit, bringing in $238,000, spending $218,000. And then in 2022, as we saw, they had a $100,000 deficit. This is far more sustainable. They don't have to go up and down with their expenses. They know how much they have and how much they can spend. This should give you a much better perspective on why the GNOME Foundation is in the situation they're in and why Robert made this post. One of the board's top priorities in hiring Holly, that being their new executive director, was therefore her experience in communications and fundraising, and building broader and more diverse support for our mission and work. Her goals since joining, as well as building her familiarity with the community and project, have been to set up better financial controls and reporting, develop a strategic plan, and start fundraising. You may have noticed Foundation being more cautious with spending this year because Holly prepared a break-even budget for the board to approve in October so that we can steady the ship while we prepare and launch our new fundraising initiatives. We haven't seen the 2023 or 2024 report because 2024 is not over yet, but if they have not properly balanced their books yet, they are going to be in serious trouble. The biggest prerequisite for fundraising is a clear strategy. We need to explain what we're doing and why it's important, and use that to convince people to support our plans. I'm very pleased to report that Holly has been working hard on this and meeting with many stakeholders across the community and has prepared a detailed and insightful 5-year strategic plan. The plan defines the areas where the Foundation will prioritize, develop, and fund initiatives to support and grow the GNOME project and community. The board has approved a draft version of this plan, and over the coming weeks, Holly and the Foundation team will be sharing this plan and running a consultation process to gather feedback input from the GNOME Foundation and community members. If GNOME wants to be spending like they have been spending close to $1 million a year, they need to pull something like Thunderbird did. Thunderbird, you might think of as a small project, but even on their bad years, even back in 2017, where the project was considered very underfunded, they were still being funded more than the entire GNOME Foundation. 2021, before the massive funding increase, was $2.7 million. After their funding drive, $6.4 million. And do you know what their funding drive was? It wasn't some link on their website. It wasn't some hidden thing that you're never going to see. It was a pop-up in your web browser. And it was a little banner that showed up when you started the application saying, "Hey, would you like to donate?" That is all. There is absolutely money in the FOSS world if you just ask for it, and ask for it in a convenient way that users are actually going to see. Both GNOME and KDE have this problem. I know there is stuff being worked on, but just putting a link on a website is not enough to get people's attention. You could also make the argument that they probably should be getting more money from their advisory board, but hey, that's a whole separate issue. The fact that they're getting less money from Google, Red Hat, System76, who's probably going to leave, I wouldn't be surprised, SUSE, than just donations is wild to me. In parallel, Holly has been working on a fundraising plan to stabilize the Foundation, growing our revenue and ability to deliver on these plans. We'll be launching a variety of fundraising activities over the coming months, including a development fund for people to directly support GNOME development, working with professional grant writers and managers to apply for government and private foundation funding opportunities, and building better communications to explain the importance of our work to corporate and individual donors. It is very hard to say what this is going to be until we see it, but it sounds like a good idea. Another observation that Holly had since joining was that we had, by general non-profit standards, a very small board of just 7 directors. While we do have some committees which have very much appreciated volunteers from outside the board, our officers are usually appointed from within the board, and many board members end up serving on multiple committees and wearing several hats. It also means the number of perspectives on the board is limited and less representative of the diverse contributors and users that make up the GNOME community. Holly has been working with the board and the governance committee to reduce how much we ask from the individual board members and improve representation from within the community within the Foundation's governance. Firstly, the board has decided to increase its size from 7 to 9 members, effective from the upcoming elections this May and June, allowing more voices to be heard within the board discussions. After that, we're going to be working on opening up the board to more participants, creating non-voting officer seats to represent certain regions or interests from across the community, and take part in committees and board meetings. These new non-voting roles are likely to be appointed with some kind of application process, and we'll share the details about these roles and how to be considered for them as we refine our plans for the coming year. I don't know about increasing the board size. Again, if we look at the KDE EV, they have a smaller board. So you can definitely make do with a smaller board. There's no rule that you need a bigger one. But hey, at this stage, adding in more voices surely can't hurt. Now, I brought this up earlier, but the funding from the Sovereign Tech Fund should also be clarified. This money is received in the form of a contract for services rather than a grant to the Foundation, and must be spent on the development areas agreed during the planning and application process. It's included within this year's budget and is all expected to be spent during this fiscal year, so it doesn't have an impact on the Foundation's reserves position. The Foundation retains a small % fee to support its costs in connection with the project, including the new requirement to have our accounts externally audited at the end of the financial year. We are putting this money towards recruitment of an administrative assistant to improve financial and other operational support for the Foundation and community, including the STF project, the Sovereign Tech Fund project, and future development initiatives. I may not be the biggest fan of GNOME, which should be pretty obvious, but at the rate they were going, I was genuinely worried for the security of the GNOME Foundation. Unless those books are pretty well balanced or a very minor deficit, they are going to be in for a very, very rough ride going forward. If they want to spend like they've been spending, they need to sort funding out, because they don't have the money left in cash reserves to keep doing that. That is not hyperbole. The GNOME Foundation has been spending tons and tons of money over the past couple of years, and they've been spending it on things that make sense to spend it on. But they spent it a little bit too quickly. Now that the money's gone, they kinda gotta rush around to fix things and make sure it doesn't actually get really bad. But what do you think? Do you think it's that big of a deal? Do you think it should have spent it slower? Or maybe you think they should have spent it faster? I would love to know. So if you like the video, go like the video. And if you really like the video and you want to become one of these amazing people over here, check out the Patreon, subscribe, Libera Pay, linked in the description down below. That's going to be it for me, and I promise not to burn all of your money.
Like this.